This reshuffle today from Anthony Albanese is not a reboot, but instead the beginning of the end of his time as Labor leader. To do a reshuffle of this sort of scale 1 week out from the return of the parliamentary year tells me two things. One, that he's got his back to the wall and he knows the sharks are circling, and two, he and his strategists fear a federal election before the end of 2021. So what do all the moves mean today and how have they been received? To discuss this and more, I'm joined now from Sydney by host of Chris Smith Tonight, Chris Smith, and from Brisbane, host of Sky News Across Australia, Peter Gleeson. Gleeson, to you first, this is a change he says he had to make, not one that he wanted to make. Here he was today defending his position.
But a bloke who was a former deputy leader and an experienced politician who'd held a wide range of portfolios and who was someone who was underestimated by some. He's now President of the United States, and I will be the leader of this country after the next election.
All right, Gleeson, so you're in the state that will make or break it for Labor at the next election. How long do you reckon Albanese's got left?
I don't think he's got long at all now after what's happened. I mean, today's front page of The Australian was a fairly pointed look at where the future of the Labor Party is in this country. Tanya Plibersek outlining her vision for the country. And, of course, then, as you said in your opener, it was left to Albanese to point out on the back foot that he did that 12 months ago and he's in the job. Now, look, in Queensland, particularly in those seats like Capricornia and Flynn and Herbert, they're the seats that will determine exactly what goes on at the next election. They are seats that are dominated by coal miners, and the Labor Party in this country is tying itself in knots on climate change policy related to, the ability of coal miners to retain their jobs. And I just think it'll be a rerun of the shortened demolition of 2019 because Albanese just hasn't got the stocks, and he's surrounded by people who unfortunately are not going to support him going forward. I think Plibersek will probably be leader by mid-year.
The big news today too, given particularly because Albanese said he was safe going into Christmas, was the dumping of the left power broker Mark Butler from the holy grail of climate change, holy grail if you're on the left, of course. He was Joel Fitzgibbon late last year, not long after he quit Albanese's front bench.
If Anthony Albanese wants to win an election, and I said this morning, I don't say this with any disrespect to Mark Butler, if he wants to win the next election, he needs a new salesperson in that role, a fresh face. It's not a reflection on Mark, but he's carrying baggage and he's going to be a target for our political opponents. Moving somewhere else where he can again exercise his talents, he's got plenty of it, and give someone else a crack.
Of course, Chris, it's not so much the personnel, it's the policies.
Yeah, can you just imagine for a second, we're in an election campaign, it's day one. Chris Bowen comes out to talk about climate change and some of the targets for 2030, 2050. And Chris Bowen, who couldn't run immigration, stuffed up the whole Treasury portfolio in opposition during the last campaign. Can you imagine him putting a number or figure, which you'll be asked, it'll be the first question, probably by our own Jonathan Lee, asked about equating in numerical terms, please, Mr Bowen, exactly how much these emissions targets will cost us. Can you imagine? Now, I like the fact that they've got rid of the climate zealot, Mark Butler. I think that's a good move. I think Joel was right. He was right when he said it then, and I think it's right to get rid of him. But you've got to make sure you put someone in the position, and it's a hot potato position, that can handle it. Chris Bowen? You're kidding, aren't you?
Yeah, I think it's a bad move, but it tells you how scared he is here of a move coming against him. I know he talks about the rules of the party room, or in his case, the Labor side, it's the caucus. But of course, what the caucus sets up as rules one day, the caucus can change the next day. It's pretty meaningless to say he's safe, and that was his line today. Gleeson, I've got to go to this issue in Queensland, this horrific death, a Queensland couple out walking their dog, their unborn child. Real pressure on the Palaszczuk government to get tough on youth crime and sentencing. He was Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton on radio this morning.
the Premier can say all she likes, that she knows the facts, she doesn't know the facts. We do know the facts already in relation to this matter. The fact is that 2 people have died unnecessarily, and we need to ask why and can it happen again? And the answer is that it can happen tomorrow because the state government in Queensland has made appointments to the judiciary over a long period of time. We've spoken about it on countless occasions, where if any reasonable person looked at the facts in some of these bail application matters, they would not give bail.
Anastasia Palaszczuk says the 17-year-old who allegedly stole the Land Cruiser, Gleeson, was out on bail. So what must happen in Queensland?
Well, this is such a tragic story, Peter, and I hark back to last year and the death of Hannah Clark at the hands of her de facto and her 3 children. And I think in many ways that was a seismic shift in the way in which we look at domestic violence, and we've seen some really strong reforms in that area in the last 9 months. And I think the same applies in this instance. I mean, the youth justice and bail laws in this state have failed. I mean, that's the reality. This is a crisis. This revolving door policy of youngsters, of alleged imbeciles like this particular fellow, allowed out on bail after a rap sheet as long as your arm. And the problem is that left faction politicians in this state have hijacked the judicial and bail system. And of course, as Peter Dutton said, and he's absolutely right, the Labor Party has been in government in this state for 25 of the last 28 years. You can imagine how many namby-pamby left-leaning judges who believe in rehabilitation rather than actually teaching these youngsters a lesson. And that's the problem. It was a big, big issue at the state election, particularly in Townsville and Cairns, but the good folk of Townsville and Cairns decided that they were going to vote the Labor Party back in. So in many respects, this is a problem that needs to be addressed at the ballot box as well as the way in which our judiciary is appointed in this state.
I want to change topic with you, Chris. We know the Liddell Power Station 2023, it's not going to be with us, which will really hit New South Wales baseload power hard. For as long as I've been doing this show, we've been talking about what comes after Liddell. A lot of talk, not a lot of action. We saw the National Party out with a manufacturing plan yesterday. You can see very much that was the topic of at least the rationale from Anthony Albanese as to why Labor was making its changes. So the Nats are on to something. Today, Angus Taylor says he's all for building a gas-fired power station in the Hunter Valley to replace this latent power out of Liddell. Are we going to actually see something happen here or more talk?
Well, in some ways, I hope we don't see the government build this thing, because that takes us back to before we privatised the distribution of electricity, and we had executives on massive money, an incredible bureaucracy because it was run by government, and an inefficiency we've never had before in the state of New South Wales. Now, if we go back to the future, do we, and start saying, oh, well, the Australian government in cahoots with the New South Wales government, who, by the way, don't want a bar of it, if they get together to start building a gas-fired power station, are we really going to see prices drop? I doubt it. And see, the problem is you've got this coal death knell. You've got people saying it's a 4-letter word. You've got, students marching down the streets. I'm sorry, but it's far better to use our coal, as Joel Fitzgibbon pointed out, and you highlighted again a little earlier, Peter. It's far better to use the Australian coal than it is to use coal from anywhere else in the world, and we should be using it, because for the next 10 years, renewables aren't going to power your electric vehicles, and probably into the second decade, we'll have to rely on coal as well. But for some reason, we've all become coalophobes, including the Prime Minister, and I think it is the wrong way to go.
Yes, and I did note when I was looking at some of the statistics on those hot days in Sydney, you were up around 70% coal-fired power to, fire up the air conditioners and keep yourselves nice and cool. So, yeah, talk is cheap when the weather is hot.
Blackouts.
Yep.
We had blackouts.
Yeah.
Like, this is our future.
It's the story
Liddell goes
right
down,
around the country,
and we'll have
isn't it?
more of them.
Yeah, absolutely, and that time is looming, 2023. All right, gentlemen, got to leave it there. Peter Gleeson, Chris Smith, thank you as always. Great to have you back on the show for this year again.